Okay, so this is my response to the John Mosman, Christopher Tanner debate over the existence of God. I'm going to start with first just pointing out a couple of things. Chris's argument as the atheist to debunk the Christian God is based off naturalism or the naturalist perspective. And while I agree that it is the only functional worldview, it probably shouldn't have been the basis of his argument, mainly because there's not too much you can actually draw from naturalism in regards to how we view God, in the sense of the Christian God or any deity for that matter. And instead, we should have looked at a more historical view. But I will address a few things that Chris argued later on in my response, including the morality of God, the contradictions of how God is perceived, and other points that he brings up, which I think are valid but need much more fleshing out. However, let's look at John's position first. Okay, John's position started out as a non sequitur and ad hominem attack against Chris, mainly because he asserted from another fallacy perspective and base. In fact, he at first argued common sense, and second argued authority, and the two fallacies come together to him attacking essentially the position that Chris has. This right here is really a function of turnaround debate. It sadly and unfortunately addressed nothing to do with God and really addressed John's inability to accept that someone else could have an authority and knowledge regarding God and intellectual ideas, metaphysicism, if you will. The point is that attacking John, attacking Chris's authority to even argue and discuss the existence of God does not disprove or prove God's existence, nor does Chris's position necessarily disprove God. And unfortunately, John's perspective is that his faith, his belief, is absolute. He even stated in the question and answer period that there is nothing that would ever convince him that there isn't a God. Let's look at some facts, though. When they were discussing the structure of reality, we have subjectivity, which was the basis of John's argument against Chris, that he had a subjective opinion that was not authoritative. And then he would argue that there is a God, and that's common sense. And unfortunately for him, that same argument that he made against Chris also works against John, because John has no authority but a subjective opinion about the existence of God. He has no evidence for God's existence. The principal issue here is really a no truth Scotsman attack, which is hidden below the other fallacies that were used on John's part. But what is reality and what is actuality, which is a key question in this debate? See, there is reality, which is what everything is from an objective point of view, an objective perspective, if you will. And then there is actuality, which is the subjective perspective that most people will have about the objective reality. See, John brought up the concept of absolutism, objectivity, and subjectivity. Well, the thing is that objectivity is an approach of subjectivity towards absolution. There is no actual in between. There is no real third option. That there is actually absolution and the metaphysical conscious reality that we live in, the actuality. So, to approach absolutism, we utilize a combination of shared subjective experiences to create a agreed upon objective view of the world. That's why we can agree that red is red, Green is green, a dog is a dog, a cat is a cat, and 7 inches is really 5.5 inches. The fact is that science is a means by testing and of testing the world, through which we can accept an objective reality. It does away with the subjective biases and asserts a process through which the most close examination of our subjective views can reach and then ultimately and effectively describe what is the absolute reality. Okay, that is why theories that we have work. That's why we have electronics. That's why we have science that allows us to have computers and phones. That's why we understand that the Earth moves around the sun. We understand fusion and things like that. Theories derived from the process are precise and designed to remove subjective bias, and subjective bias is what leads to faith-based arguments. This is why evolution is true, and in fact, this is why the theory of gravity is true, and in fact, it is why our electronics again work, and why we can send people into space. Authority comes from knowledge and experience. One's belief does not give authority, but evidence based on reality presented as it is, or the lack of evidence is sufficient authority to dismiss God. And the reason why I can fairly and justly say this is because of a nominal theory that exists within the theological and philosophical studies, which many theologians prescribe to, and that is the progressive loss theory. Basically, at the beginning of time, when we humans actually started recording our history through various means, mostly through stories, shared stories, I should say the beginning of our time, we created gods to explain those things that we don't understand or didn't understand at the time. And this ranged from why there's, big thunder in the skies, why there's lightning, why we have things that are consistently, outside of our purview. And we created gods to explain them. Basically is, we don't know how to research this thing, so there must be a cause. We don't know what the cause is, so it must be God. Hundreds of different tribes created thousands of gods. In some cases, there are still religions today that have gods for every little thing that exists. But as science improved, as we started learning and understanding the real world, the material world, the world in which we live, gods started disappearing. This is a fact. You look at the beginning and end of any existing past, present, or current pantheon, and you'll see a slow but progressive loss of gods, an amalgamation of gods, until either the religion is completely scrapped for a new religion, or the gods have been unified into a single god structure. And this includes Christianity as well, because Christianity started as a triathic god system, or a trinity. Before the Council of Nicaea put together the Bible, the vast majority of people did not see Christ, the Holy Spirit, and God as the same being. Yet, nowadays, in most variants of Christianity, most of the different sects of Christianity, they are seen as the same thing, the same being. So, the interesting part about the whole deity aspect is the loss of gods. And loss of gods indicates a revolution of knowledge. As we gain more information, learn new things, we dismiss the old explanations until we get down to one key part of religion, and that is the concept of the afterlife. And even now, science is still tackling that issue through fair observation. And we actually know a lot more about what happens to us after we die. We actually know and understand that our brains continue to work long after our heart stops and goes into this kind of frantic state where we have these wild imaginations, the whole entire idea, in fact, of our entire life flashing before our eyes. It's actually a pretty common thing, and is explained by erratic firing of the synapses as the body dies and as the brain tries to keep the body alive. On morality, John argued that morality can't be explained by evolution. This is total bunk. Morality is derived from our evolutionary path and our formation of social dependencies. As living things evolve, they gain knowledge which help them to survive. That knowledge varies in type and complexity. The most simplest life forms out there have very, very basic genetic knowledge that's stored in their genes and is passed on from generation to generation. We call this epigenetic instinct. But instincts evolved with more complex animals, and those instincts became more and more complex as more and more social complex structures came to existence. That is why, for example, wolf packs will protect their own. That is why lion prides will protect their own. They have an instinct to drive their life. Humans are no different. We have those same instincts. We have the basic drives: sex drive, hunger, the need to eat, the need to sleep, the need to breathe, the need to have social companionship. And the reason why we have social systems now, as complex as they are, and laws and social order, is because we started with a social instinct. We were social people, social animal. And we see those same instincts and even social constructs in other animals that are related to us that are on a higher level than some of the lower caste animals. And what I mean by lower caste is those that don't necessarily have self-awareness. But if you look at dolphins, you look at whales, you look at the chimpanzees and great apes, you look at some of the more complex social animals, including elephants and a whole variety of different birds. There's a social hierarchy that exists. Excuse me. From which moral constructs can be found. So much so that things like thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, those concepts that are commonly attributed to the Ten Commandments, are really universal and are found in pretty much all different social systems and cultures. The reason why is because as we evolved before we split apart and left Africa, we had derived a system, a social system, that basically ensured or helped to ensure our survival. If you kill, your dad and mom, they aren't there to help you to get food or protect you from enemies. If you kill the group leaders, or if you steal food from this person, they're not going to trust you, and they aren't going to help you when you need to be helped. The whole entire structure of morals and instincts are intrinsically connected, and they cannot be divided. What John has fallen for is the rhetoric and the unfortunate belief that morals come from religion, and they don't. Almost every single, if not every single existing religion out there has taken on the mantle of morals and kind of perverted them into something that they're not. And that brings me to the concept of sin. See, sin is an invalid concept derived from a belief of disobeying God, because specifically in the Christian religion, that because Eve decided to eat of the forbidden fruit, an unknown fruit, from the story anyways, we don't know what fruit it is, and tricked Adam into eating the fruit, and thus violated God's rule, and it's the original sin, and we somehow carry that sin as humanity. But the fact is that the Genesis story in which we have founded original sin on is predated by Moses as a story, and predated by Noah as a story. In fact, it is a fairly young story that occurred around 1000 BC, and is really about a Syrian king and his prince son, who was one of three sons put into one of the royal gardens and regional gardens, which supplied food for the masses as desertification crossed what is now called Saudi Arabia. The prince, Anahim, which gets translated to Adam, was a virgin under the age of 10 and grew up in the garden alongside most of the vestigial, not vestigial, what's the word I'm looking for? Basically the women virgins, the female virgins that were pure, that were supposed to keep the, is it vistal? I can't remember. But nonetheless, basically a whole bunch of virgin girls are kept in these gardens to keep the gardens pure, because they believed food was a holy thing. And the forbidden fruit was really sex. The snake, well, Adam's penis. And it should come of no surprise, because the fact that there are 5 different versions of Genesis in the original version of the King James Bible before it got translated into modern English and had them removed. And even now, there's still mention of Lilith, who was the first woman, quote unquote, who was older and wanted to be on top of Adam. And that's why she was cast out of the garden. In reality, Lilith was a much older woman who had never had sex, who had been in the gardens for much longer, came across the dear prince, tried to have sex. They were caught, and she was kicked out of the garden for violating the rules of the garden. Nonetheless, the fact is, sin is a misconcept. There is no sin whatsoever. If anything, the concept of sin is related to religion, because it is a violation of the religious codices, the dogma of the religion, and more or less should be ignored because it has no value whatsoever. The fact is that sin as a human concept, because that's what it is really just a rejection of the moral codes that have been perverted by the religions that exist. And what is sin in one religion isn't a sin in another religion. And that's provable simply by the fact that there are religions in the United States, like, say, Wicca, which have no problems whatsoever with homosexuals. But then you have huge groups of Christians who say being a gay person, which is outside of being a gay, is control. You know, you can't change your genetics to stop being gay, is being a sin, and is being sinful. The fact is that neither of them are true. Neither case is true. There's no such thing as sin there. On the matter of faith, Chris makes the point that faith is a bridging between understanding reality and the supernatural. But even the supernatural is explained by science. We know why we see ghosts. We know why we see things that go bump in the night. And it's because we are able to pick out patterns, even when there aren't any patterns. And we want to see things because our instincts, again, tell us to look out for those things that might just kill us in the night. But in reality, faith is a bridge between reality and the wishfully hopeful and wishful thinking that God exists. The want and need for God to exist. Because people are so deeply ingrained with this concept, God does in fact have a real-world influence, though. Because people believe God exists, and because people go to church, they have a actual concept in their head which influences their actions. They believe that if they act a certain way, God will act favorably towards them. And in that one single sense, God is real. Because even if there's no physical God, even though there's no God that's going to go poof and answer your prayers, because people believe in God, they act in accordance to what they think God wants, and that is a huge problem. when it comes to questioning God, and it comes to using experience with God, we have no means whatsoever to accept experience as evidence for God. That's because our experiences are purely subjective. And outside of our subjective meta reality, our actuality, there is no God whatsoever. There is no way of proving it. And in that same sense, God is no different than Allah, Vishnu, Odin, the Shinto gods, or even Santa Claus. And in the same sense that people who believe in God are, afraid that they might not go to heaven, it's the same as though a child is afraid that they're not going to get presents because they were bad and Santa Claus is going to give it to them. It's that same level of sway. Though I think Santa Claus is an unfair comparison purely because at least Santa Claus was a real person, albeit nowhere near the type of person that we imagine him to be today. So let's look at some facts. All cultures across the world have gods. Our entire human history is filled with gods, many of which are based on the soul and sun god construction. Many are based on a naturalistic world, and most gods actually have no care for humans whatsoever. Even so, principally as science advanced and changed how we view the world, gods dwindled and changed and progressively disappeared. The multi-god, multi-theistic cultures and pantheons slowly but assuredly always progressed into a monotheistic god system. So, to recap, my biggest complaints about this debate is, one, John failed to adhere to basic rules. He didn't actually address the question. He addressed what he saw as an inaccurate basis for Chris's argument, and that was based on fallacy, a faulty view of reality. Chris basically failed to address the elephant in the room, which is that God doesn't exist outside of our concept and outside of conceptualized ideas of what God is. John asserted that Chris had no authority to argue, but the same argument can be made against him in regard to his position. He has no authority either. If a person that can attain evidence that supports his position, which is that naturalism works and that science explains the world and we don't actually need God to exist anymore, and that's why gods have disappeared or have been relegated to mythology and mythos and legends, then a person who believes in God, who can't find a single shred of evidence whatsoever beyond their own personal experience and what they have conceptualized, actually has even less authority to argue in the first place. So that's the end of my response. Thank you for listening.